Colorado, a state built by railroads, not Subarus and Tacomas. But let's take a look at what we once had. The Denver and Rio Grande, a real railroad. It went everywhere the hard way. Here's a bit more of a consolidated look at the system Colorado used to have, and here we are in the present day with what's left. I know, get it out of your system. It's tragic. A brief moment of silence for some fallen flags. But what if we could revive some of this legacy? What if we could undo the damage that car-centric design and highways have done to our environment? What if we could go back to something like this? What you're looking at is a possible vision for what we could do in Colorado. And I know this map looks quite complicated and there's a lot here, but what you need to realize is that most of everything you see here already exists. Aside from the I-70 AGS and the Front Range Corridor, every other rail line on this map is in the ground right now. I think it's no understatement to say that in America, we have really dropped the ball with our railroads. We bet the entire country on highways, we forced everyone to fund their own transit, and we have really backed ourselves into a corner. Basically, to do anything in about 90% of this country requires a car. And the worst part is that the auto lobbies and the oil lobbies convinced us that it was our own idea. They're the ones who ripped up the streetcars, they're the ones who lobby against public transit, and they're the ones that ran the railroads out of business in the first place and ripped up all this track. So we're left with a skeleton after over a half century of negligence and greed by the powers that be. And the question is, why now? Why should we care about rail? Why should we even bother trying to resurrect this fallen service that people will say no one will use it, it'll be too expensive, we shouldn't bother? And to which I say, are we going to be the generation that let climate change win because of the greed and political control of a few, and because the alternative was financially inconvenient? For most Americans, we see trains as a gimmick, as an attraction, because we fundamentally don't understand how they work. We see them almost in the same way how we see a roller coaster or a Disney park ride. We struggle to see the way how trains can complement a car-centric society, because we use our cars to cover everything from a trip to the grocery store to a trip across the country. We keep on trying to work trains around the automobile when it really needs to be done the other way around. Which brings me back to the map. The reason why this system is so extensive is because it needs to be comprehensive. We can't just have a handful of rail lines here and there. The system needs to be interconnected and serve a variety of purposes. Colorado is an interesting state in that 80% of our population is concentrated along the Front Range. Even though there's a large population concentration here, the individuals who live here love to spend time in central Colorado inside the interior of the mountains. And so far, we've always been driving into the mountains, sometimes taking a bus, but for the most part, we're all using our own personal vehicles. The issue with this system is that it doesn't scale well with popularity. As these mountain towns and mountain recreation in general becomes more popular, you'll reach a point where you just can't add another lane to many of these mountain roads. It'll be prohibitively expensive, and even if you could squeeze one more lane in, it's not going to solve the capacity problem. Not to mention the environmental problems of continuing to use very inefficient personal vehicles, or the sheer amount of lithium and cobalt we'd have to extract to give everyone a Tesla. The situation as it is where we need to just find a much more efficient way, both in terms of raw resources and in energy, to keep people moving. Otherwise, everything's going to grind down to a halt. So in this map that I've built here, we have our Zephyr and we have our Chief, the two Amtrak lines that currently run through the state. I've also included the Front Range Corridor, which I truly hope gets built. Down at Pueblo, you'll see two branches. There has been talk about rerouting the Southwest Chief through Pueblo, but critics say it's already making a long train trip that much longer, so I'd rather see an extension come down to La Junta or Trinidad. I am in favor of the Pueblo to Trinidad extension because it could open up the San Luis Valley, even though that's a pretty low priority corridor. Moving north, we then have Denver proper, where we do see the Front Range Corridor continue all the way up to Cheyenne, Wyoming. Heading west, we have the Central Corridor, otherwise known as the Moffett Subdivision. Here you see a little green line, that's Steamboat Springs. I do believe that we should add a second ski train that goes all the way up to Steamboat Springs, in addition to the existing ski train that goes to Winter Park. This way we can see a lot more rail traffic along the Central Corridor that's carrying people and relieving stress off of I-70. Speaking of I-70, I do plan on talking about this in more detail at a future point, but there is the I-70 AGS, sometimes known as the I-70 monorail. Now, whether it's a monorail or a rack railway or some kind of expedited bus route, BRT, bus rapid transit, I do think that something needs to be done on I-70, or else that entire system's just going to clog and continue to crash every single time there's a powder day out there. And of course, we have my darling, the Tennessee Pass. This rail line is still intact. It runs from Docero all the way down into Parkdale, which is just outside of Canyon City. This rail line is still intact. This rail line is still in the ground, and it needs to see passenger service again. Even though it runs through what some would call a sparsely populated area in all of Colorado, it's more of the matter of this line exists and it connects the Zephyr and the Chief if it were to be implemented. Additionally, if that AGS system were ever built along I-70, we get a very nice loop all the way back into Denver. I'm sure if anyone out there is still listening and they've gotten this far in the video, they're probably wondering why. Why bother? Why should we even consider building a rail network anywhere near this extensive? I mean, one, I'd say I don't mind being like Switzerland, but if you need some other points, I'm going to get more into the route philosophy in this second half of the video. We should not be hypocrites. So, Colorado claims to be an environmentally conscientious state. While not in the top 10 greenest states, which I find ironic, we rank more in the middle with the tables I've seen. Not the worst, not the best. We're not Vermont, but we're also not Texas. Given how much of our state is dependent upon recreational tourism, I see the preservation of the environment as not only vital to the planet, but also to the state's economy as a whole. We need to reconcile our environmental claims and aspirations with our actions. No, that does not mean we all need to buy Teslas. Second, I'd like to address transport safety. There are around 600 to 700 fatalities per year on Colorado roads. This has been started as a trend since 2017. This figure has been trending up since 2010. With the increased amount of tourism and recreation in small mountain towns and ski resorts, this number is likely to continue to rise. Thus far, there have already been 51 pedestrian deaths in Colorado at time of recording, so providing alternative modes for both locals and out-of-state tourists will help us keep everyone safer. This one right here is going to be a big, difficult one for a lot of people to digest, but it's becoming more apparent. We need to provide a more equitable and just transport network. The mountains have always been seen as a kind of escape, but an escape for who? The wealthy, the powerful, the elite, the ones that can? The exclusivity of mountain towns have an interesting history. The once dirty boom towns and mining towns of Colorado, like Telluride, have been gentrified into ski havens and idealistic retreats. Since the 1960s, many of these towns remain accessible only by car or by other private means of transport. Looking at you, Aspen. I have heard various arguments against the implementation of public transit in these small mountain communities, such as the train will bring in the riffraff. We like our town small and remote and exclusive. And of course, especially, the train wouldn't make money. There is an element of classism here which will not serve these communities well in the future. Fail! Providing alternative and more environmentally friendly and efficient modes of transport will allow more people to experience Colorado's beauty without the paywall of car ownership. Lastly, if the riffraff comes into town by train, then the town will be less crowded. The locals' perception of lack of parking, compared to a weekday, induces the notion that town is crowded today. It's not the additional foot traffic that makes them feel crowded. It's the inconvenience that comes with every parking spot in town being taken up by a tourist. That's what makes them feel the town's being more crowded. Not more people, it's more cars. We need to remember that Colorado was built on railroads, a fact we seem all too quick to forget. We had this little weird love affair with cars and highways, but it's time to get back to our roots and back to our rails. This is where we were, this is where we are, and this is where we could be.